Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Outside of the Classroom podcast. Thank you for joining to tune in to this episode. Thank you for listening, subscribing. We do have to say subscribing or following, I think, is also another term. And of course, thank you for sharing. Really, what you have found useful in these episodes and sharing with others in your network, whether those are stories of people who are building careers or building businesses or in the case of today's talk, hearing about a perspective. And that's what this format is. We'll hear from a guest who has a point of view. Any point of view could be a little misleading, but has a topic that he's been passionate about and he sees some value in talking about it and sharing about it. I got introduced to James, I think about, I want to say a few weeks ago at an event where he was talking about this approach as it relates to business and business building. And of course, as you know, in Canada, that's a big focus for us right now. So without much more of a longer delay, let me welcome James Stauch to the podcast. Welcome, James.
Thanks so much, Nigel. Great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you, James. And just for some context, you are on the East Coast right now, and I'm
I
in
am.
Quebec.
I live in a place called Bridgewater, which is about an hour south of Halifax, on the part of Nova Scotia called the South Shore. And it really, I mean, this is a beautiful country, but it's a really beautiful part of our beautiful country.
Yeah, I listen. I've been as far west as I can go, not as far north as I can, but I hadn't gone east. So it looks like I need to get out there. You're not the first one to talk about the beauty of the East Coast, so maybe that'll happen this summer. We'll see. We'll see.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah. And I'm in Quebec City, as I mentioned to you, enjoying the windy, cold weather, but it's sunny, so no real complaints.
Yeah.
Um, so James, let's start off, and again, thank you for wanting to be on and using this platform to talk about what you're working on. Maybe give us a bit of context, background, kind of a little bit of your history and what led you up to where you are now.
Sure. Yeah. And I should probably mention I've lived in different parts of Canada over the years, not just the East Coast, the far north, Ontario, Alberta. Um, so on my LinkedIn profile, I describe myself as a social innovation and systems change educator and sense maker. Um, um, I, in terms of my background, most recently, well, let me back up a bit. I spent about 12 years in formally working in the field of professional philanthropy.
Hmm.
Um, Years ago. So I variously working as a grant maker, executive, and then another 3 or so years as a consultant. This was very wide-ranging work. The most interesting component of that work was working in partnership with communities in the Arctic and the far
Hmm.
north. These are communities that are still, in many ways, undertaking nation building initiatives pursuant to the completion of what we call modern treaties or land claim agreements, self government agreements, and so on. It's unbelievably fascinating work that, for me, made it easier to see many of the biases and worldviews that
Hmm.
a kind of mainstream Euro Canadian culture holds. I spent another dozen years after that as the founding executive director of an institute, the Institute for Community Prosperity, at Mount Royal University, which is based in Calgary. And there I developed a range of leadership programs, systems focused and futures oriented learning programs for undergrad students, also for the broader community. So we were kind of in the membrane between academia and the broader community. So in that work, I did a lot of foresight, strategic foresight, trend analysis, landscape scanning, sense making around contemporary issues, and not just social issues, but like ecological, economic, political, technological, even cultural. And then right now, I am working in the private sector, actually. So I serve as what's called complex system strategist with Atco Ventures. ATCO is a global company. It's
Yeah.
based in Western Canada. It's really it's involved in a range of industries, a range of sectors. Probably best known for modular housing. It's one of the world's leading modular housing providers, but also a range of things like energy transmission. Um, and they do a lot of work with Indigenous northern communities, a lot of equity partnerships, and quite a wide-ranging set of investments in again a wide-ranging set of industries. And they quite uniquely are one of very few companies who really operationalize a kind of systems-led or problem-first approach to innovation. And that in turn is tied to ACO is a publicly traded company, but it's also a family-controlled company.
Mm.
And so they're interested in multi-generational impact and legacy. And so a company that is interested in that sort of long-term longevity has to be hyper aware of some of the broader cultural, economic, political currents that are happening worldwide. And how does the company not just fit into that and take advantage of opportunities attached to that, but how do we start anticipating what the future looks like in 10 years, 20 years,
Yeah.
50 years, and so on. So they're very strategic about investing in that systems-led approach, and that's also informed some of their broader partnerships outside the company, even outside the commercial realm. So they partner with, for example, Western University, the Ivy School of Business, has a program called Innovation North that operates a kind of systems-led innovation challenge,
Mm.
led by Tima Bansell and her team there. They also are quite involved with the Skoll Center, which is based at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. And they run a systems mapping competition that ABCO is a very large multi-year sponsor of. So uh, that's kind of landed me where I am in this kind of interstitial space between sectors and industries
Yeah.
and between academia and the world of commerce and the world of civil society.
And so is that the common theme in your, in the work that you've been doing? And is it around community and impact in society, like sort of community building and what can we do to sort of build for the long term? Is that a bit of a theme that you've been following or been leading
Yeah,
you to
definitely. I
different
mean, those
things?
have been questions that I've been grappling with for some time in different ways and in different guises. Um, it's kind of interesting. ACCO's motto is to create prosperity and opportunity for generations to come. I ran an institute that was about community prosperity, but really largely focused on civil society, NGOs, social movements, philanthropy, and so on. But there's such a strong synergy, and nowadays, there's so much crossover between sectors
Mm.
that it's actually um, we don't have enough tools that speak to multiple sectors. We typically have streamed these siloed pathways and again that's a Euro Canadian thing or a European Euro American phenomenon. Um, one of those epiphanies that I mentioned earlier is working in and with Indigenous communities. You realize, hey, everything is connected, and people
Mm.
say that over and over again. I mean, if you've ever been in a room with an elder speaking, there's some version of that. Things are connected. Everything is connected, and it's not just metaphor. It really is. It really is true, and what that implies is that the categories that we choose to label things, whether those are academic disciplines, for example, or whether those are industrial categories, or whether those are, how we label sectors and how we conceive of, well, this should be a nonprofit thing, or this should be a government responsibility, or this should be a private sector thing. those are fundamentally arbitrary. And I think one of the kind of backstories to why this book came to be was that realization that actually we're all kind of finding our way in the dark in a very similar way. And some of what's missing for, say, small nonprofits in terms of um, their tendency, because there's just not enough time to do anything, right? Time is always of the essence. Um, there's a tendency to focus on a highly visible and often seductive solution. And sometimes it's because it's path dependent, that solution has been one that has been applied for a generation or more. Other times it's just really, really sexy and attractive. And you find that that's true in government, that's true in the commercial sector, it's true in technology, it's true in civil society. And so we really wanted to step back in creating this book to say, this isn't a book for social change activists. This isn't a book for startups. This isn't a book for investors. It's a book for all of them and then some. Um, and trying to connect the threads across those various worlds.
Yeah.
What do we have in common? What are some of the tools that we can use in common?
So let's talk about that. So you have a history in that space that I guess, from my words, you've been able to see these connections, these interdependencies on business and society and people. You're now working with ATCO, and that's what led you to develop, or I shouldn't say develop, but write this book called The 55 Minutes, correct?
Mhm.
Right? That's the title I remember. I do have a copy. Thank you, by the way. I'm slowly reading it. Um, and so I guess, I think what would be helpful is if you could, how would you describe what that book is about, and really the underlying topic is around systems thinking, but you can, obviously do a better explanation than I can. So what is, I have a few questions about the book, but maybe just tell us, what is the 55 minutes about?
Sure. Yeah. The 101 is so the subtitle is we describe it as an atlas to navigate problems, reveal systems, and ask beautiful questions in a radically shifting world. We describe it as an atlas rather than just a garden variety book, because while you can read it to cover, it's 570 pages, and we really want it to be used as a reference tool. So in principle, you can start anywhere.
Mm,
It's a 20 chapter resource for practitioners working in any, like I say, any sector. It's an open access compendium of mapping tools, frameworks, concepts, um, and broadly speaking, it helps innovators, and I use that term advisedly, innovators thoroughly understand um, the nature, the depth, the origins, the potential trajectories of a problem that they're interested in and the systems that produce and hold it in place. So it's really trying to develop a skill around problem understanding.
mm,
So the best way to, and the reason it's entitled the 55 minutes is it takes its inspiration from Albert Einstein's aphorism that, if he was given an hour to solve a really difficult problem and his life depended on it, he would take the first 55 minutes of that hour to just think about the problem, to ask questions of the problem, to interrogate it, and only the last 5 minutes to act, to try and solve the problem. But our thesis is that most of us live and work in contexts where the dominant culture invests, places value,
mm,
places incentive structures on just that last 5 minutes, that action space.
mhm,
So that's where most of our organizations and institutions act and are incentivized to act. And that could be, so that 5 minutes to us includes design, invention, regulation, venture creation, litigation, or some other form of an intervention or innovation. It's not about understanding the problem. And so the book champions this problem informed or deep problem informed understanding approach to innovation. And by implication, um, that also means every single problem, big or small, complex or not, is created and sustained by some kind of system or some combination of systems. So, integral to problem understanding is having some appreciation for understanding systems as well. So that's kind of embedded in this as well, but it's not fronted in the sense of this is this is the textbook on systems thinking. There are lots of resources on systems thinking, some highly theoretical,
Hmm.
some more pragmatic. Um, Systems thinking is important, but it's not the only piece of problem understanding. And our main thing is that we again this kind of widespread solutions first, ask questions later mentality that pervades, and it's not just kind of the commercial innovation space; it's public innovation ecosystems as well, and nonprofit, um, where we tend to focus on narrow optimization rather than widening the scope and looking at broader contextual
Hmm.
awareness.
And so you and I had talked before today's call, and we were talking about why is that? Why does that occur? And I'm wondering, just to pick up on some of that previous conversation, is this rush to solution driven by a lot of what we see on social media or even in business languages around first to market and go to market strategy, product market fit, all around really oriented around solution than really problem. And I'm not saying there's no focus on understanding the problem, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on why is there so much of a focus on the solution? What are some of those forces that you've seen that's really causing people to just go to problem solving and not problem understanding?
Yeah, I mean, urgency. I certainly wouldn't want to diminish or trivialize um, the number and the profundity of the problems that we are faced with as a society, as a world. Those range from geopolitical to ecological to trade and commerce, to housing, and on and on and on, and they're all connected. The the tendency though is um, we're either working to political deadlines, the next election
Mm,
cycle, like in the US, that's like every 2 years, right, with interims. Or, in a corporate setting, it could be quarterly board meetings or annual
mm,
meetings. In a nonprofit setting, it's meeting funder deadlines, the scope or parameters of the grant. Very few institutions actually have the privilege or benefit of thinking long term or thinking deeply at all. However, it's uh, paradoxically the urgency of our problems are precisely why we need to slow down, um, because they are that important. And because what we tend to do is we're more likely to attack a symptom of a problem, which is
mm,
kind of playing whack-a-mole in a lot of cases, right? You see the symptom, it's highly visible, we attack it, and we can even scale our approach to that system, and for years, sometimes decades, never really get serious about asking the questions about why is this happening. So, for example, we see Food Banks Canada just came out with a recent report about food security in Canada. Um, some jurisdictions are seeing not just double-digit growth, in some cases triple-digit growth, and that it is a crisis. It's a severe crisis that can't really get too high up in the news because there's a war going on, and
mm.
there's a measles outbreak, and there's this and there's that, right? And so there's major forces and dynamics happening that often don't get a lot of play. And so here's food security. Well, what do? We have food banks. Great. Food banks are really important in the same way that domestic violence shelters are really important for rising rates of partner-based violence or domestic violence. But they're not solutions, right? They are um, important um, uh, emergency responses to problems that are much more structural in nature. When you actually look at the food bank's data, you find, oh, most of the regular users are actually employed.
Hmm.
Um, but when you look at the cost of energy, when you look at the cost of housing, especially in Canada, um, the cost of insurance, and on, um, and the stagnancy of wages, the access to food, the price of healthy food, right? Healthy produce, um, all of that conspires to say, hey, maybe we need to step back a bit and think more systemically about, well, how is this coming to be? What every single problem is a symptom of a deeper problem. And so asking some of the questions that we surface in the book um, is a way to, before you innovate, before you come up with before you ideate, before you brainstorm, before you test you get into your testing and go to market strategies, you need to reasonably be able to ask. We posit 11 questions in the book. And if you can reasonably answer those questions, provided you don't have to be comprehensive,
Hmm.
but a cogent answer to those questions, um, then yeah, you're in good shape. You can, so we don't, we, I think a lot of people look at the book and they hear the Einstein metaphor and they go, oh, but this sounds like analysis paralysis. Like this sounds
Hmm.
like we're going to be spinning our wheels forever. We don't have time to do that.
Yeah.
Um, but actually, asking each of these 11 questions, you may find 5 of them you can answer. You actually already have enough knowledge about your market, for example, or you've worked long enough in the field directly. You have that lived experience. You've apprenticed with the problem in many cases. But if you're new to the problem, if you're new to the context, you might have to do the homework and a lot of the groundwork. You can get a little bit of a ways with a great idea, but usually that's within a kind of hermetically sealed bubble where everyone's sort of cheering you on.
Mm.
And then when you're kind of thrust into the cold light of day, the actual market context or the actual societal context, you learn some very hard lessons very quickly. Um, and it's not just startups and it's not just startups and students that do this. It's a problem that large companies encounter all the time. Um,
What's
yeah.
what's your thoughts around this iterative approach to building solutions, building products? So MVP, minimum viable product. I'm sure you're familiar with that idea, where um, businesses, not only in a software space, but now it applies more generally, will say, well, we don't have all of the requirements, if you will, figured out yet, but we have 60, 70%. So we'll put it onto the market and test, figure out what's not working, revise, go back again, iteration 2, iteration 3. How do you see that? What's your thoughts on that iterative process to somehow meet in the middle of trying to reach these deadlines, or meet the deadlines, or meet external expectations, but at the same time learn more about what the problem is that we're solving? Is that, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, I mean, you need you need some information about the nature of if you can, a synonym for problem is market. You can actually view it this way.
Hmm.
Um, a market can be helpfully seen as a latent space for solutions, but solutions to a problem. Like you don't have solutions unless you have a problem, and so there's a sort of latent demand that emerges because people are experiencing some kind of pain or some kind of something suboptimal, where you can come in with your solution, your intervention, and 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 alleviate or improve the situation, sometimes dramatically. So it's hard to think of markets without thinking of problems. And when you read people like, Ash Moria or Eric Rees or Michael Porter or any of these guys, Clay Christensen, they all talk about, like, if you don't understand your market, if you don't understand the nature of the problem, you're not ready. So you need some of that baseline understanding for sure. But then, your question is, what does that mean for the value of testing, of prototyping, and actually having multiple iterations? I That is very valuable. I think it's important to underline that we're not saying that it should be sequential, that you should do
Mm,
learn, 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 and go. Um, and that the learn, learn, learn means that everything should be planned soup to nuts before you act. That's not what we're saying at all. What we're saying is actually planning. Don't waste your time doing too much planning. Planning is always trumped by emergence.
mm,
So it's operationalizing the 55 minutes, eh, or the tools in the 55 minutes doesn't mean getting stuck in analysis paralysis. It means shifting from a sort of rigid fail-safe planning mode to more of a what Dave Snowden, who's a complexity theorist, he talks about probe, sense, respond. And that's small scale, safe to fail experiments to test
mm,
hypotheses about the system, about the nature about the potential interventions or leverage points as you're learning. And so it's much more of a dialogue. It's not a linear learn, 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 do.
yeah.
This is actually learn, act, learn, act in a kind of continuous cycle of reflection. Um, it's unfortunate that we have the technology of a book that's a linear technology, but
Mm,
it really is thought of better as a kind of constantly looping or spiraling kind of dialogue between
yeah.
action and learning. So I'm a big fan of prototyping and iteration. Now, the context is important. For technological innovation, quite often, prototyping is pretty safe to do, even for stuff that's just cool. Like,
Mm,
even if you haven't done much problem understanding. Obviously, the more you get into more sensitive social intervention, let's think of, you might have a new approach that you want to try around how to get refugees into the job market, or how to get how to reduce rates of recidivism, for offenders. Those are tough human challenges that you want to be careful about prototyping. You need enough confidence that your prototype won't damage human beings, right? So the sort of move fast and break stuff maxim that Zuckerberg sort of that's come to sort of be the kind of gospel statement for Silicon Valley. It applies more safely in a technological environment, although we're seeing now that even that's not
mm,
not going to work with
mm,
with advanced AI. Uh, but that certainly has never worked in a complex social setting where moving fast and breaking stuff means the stuff you're breaking are human beings.
yeah.
Um, so there's uh, we use the word a lot, innovation theater or solutioneering or heropreneurship, as the kind of theatrical element of innovation that this book, I think, is a direct affront to. This is a direct challenge to the theatricality of a lot of the innovation space. And that's maybe one helpful way to look at it.
Hmm. That's a good point you brought up around the ability to prototype, iterative development, learn, fail, move fast, break things, is I'll say more historically and continues to be seen in the technology space. But as we're seeing now, just to your point, or that you referenced Zuckerberg, um, well, now we're seeing the downstream impacts. If you've been following the
Mm.
testimony that's going on in terms of cognitive underdevelopment in young children and so on, But to the point around, I guess one of the questions I really want to ask is, do you see this systems thinking? Is that the right way I should describe it? System thinking's approach.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah. Do you see that that tool, that approach being more effective in some industries, some types of business, perhaps some businesses in certain stages than other? Not saying no effect, but more, where would be the sort of greatest return of using this approach? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, for sure. We actually devote a part of the kind of introductory section of the book to having more sort of detailed. This is how this would benefit you if you are, for example, a government policymaker. So if you're a policy analyst or a planner within government, it's really, really obvious that you should be employing systems thinking tools. In fact, I would regard it as malpractice if it
Mm,
didn't play into that, because you, by its nature, any sort of large scale government policy is dealing with huge complexity. I would say this as well. So many of these tools are applicable for investors, um, for venture capitalists.
mm,
We and uh, they resonate with common sense too, right? Like just to give you one principle that we talk about a lot, it's the principle of requisite variety, and it's a fairly simple concept. It basically just means that any system, whether and a system could be an organization or a company, any system should have more potential states uh, than the surrounding environment in order to be durable, resilient, resistant to shocks that may come along. And that principle comes from evolutionary biology. So if you think of speciation, the more variety there is within a particular species, when environmental change happens, some version of that species, some possible state of that species is able to adapt better than the other possible states. But if you only have one species type with very little variety or very little diversity, then it's fragile. It can work in the right context
mm,
beautifully, but if the context shifts, it's extremely fragile. And so if you think about organizations, any type of organization, that same principle applies. So then you start to think, well, geez, okay, we should be incorporating some of these terms or these concepts and frameworks into management, into organizational leadership. So if you're leading any kind of medium or large organization, those are all complex settings. There are human beings involved, there are stakeholders, there are vendors, there are suppliers, and so on. Um, and so the list, I'm biased to saying like the list is really, really long of the number of people who can benefit from this and um, who can see ways of applying this in their own work. But yes, absolutely. As a general rule, the more complex
yeah.
your work is, the more stakeholders you have, um, the more variety there is in your ambit, then absolutely this is going to help you.
Yeah. Uh,
You know, if you're employed as a this is a cartoonish example. You're employed as a factory worker in a industry that's likely to be around for a while. Yeah, okay, this isn't going to be top of your reading list.
sure.
But I think increasingly more and more people are not in those kinds of situations. People are between jobs, between careers. They are often volunteers with organizations that are dealing with something complex. And so it's a very, very long list.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think, yeah, I so we have particular, you know, we have a whole section on investing. And what does this mean for investors? What does this mean for policymakers? What does this mean for um, teachers and educators? Um, all of those could benefit anyone working in healthcare, especially in health policy, hospital management, um, uh, procurement, uh, training could benefit from these tools, concepts, frameworks.
So a couple of things, and um, with AI doing what it's doing and doing what it hasn't done yet and disrupting business and really changing the way we work, this is not news, but this is just what's happening to us. That could also create some disruption to the systems that existed before that we would need to relook at, I guess, what are our solutions. But really, I wanted to ask more around, you said VCs could benefit from this. And I hadn't thought of VCs being, a candidate or somebody who would get value out of this. And as soon as you said it, I think it clicked for me. But could you? Maybe my click is different, but could you explain or just explain why you see the VC getting value out of sort of adopting a systems thinking approach to their work?
Yeah. So one of the reasons is, good VCs are highly relational. They don't invest in the pitch or they don't invest in the abstract um, piece of what is being proposed. They invest in the people, generally speaking, right?
Hmm.
Is this person creative? Can they get this done? Do they have a track record? I need to get to know this person. If I'm going to put money behind this business, I'm not going to be passively watching from the sidelines and crossing my fingers. I actually need to, without unduly meddling, I need to develop a relationship that builds some trust and builds some deeper knowledge. So the relationality, we talk a lot about the power of relationality, the power of networking as well, in the book. And then also that whole principle of um, diversifying your portfolio so that you yourself as an investor have created the possibility of multiple states
Mm.
in an environment where things are changing rapidly and unpredictably. You might invest in this type of technology, but also this type of technology and this type might actually surprise you and win out at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
like we don't know who's going to win the AI race right now. It's a kind of a, in a way, and in a good way, it's kind of the Wild West phase of AI development. Um, and so I think most investors would want to build enough of that so-called requisite variety in their approach. Um, and there's also i- in addition to the trust piece, you there's a kind of I think most VCs understand this instinctively, but I think it's underlined in the book, that the you need to allow emergence to happen. That most VCs, if you talk to them, will say business plans are almost completely useless.
Mhm.
They might be useful for getting a loan from a bank, or getting more institutional forms of funding. And they might be kind of modestly useful as a kind of artifact on which to show that you've thought through enough key components of the business that there's no blind spots. But in reality, business plans, and this extends to any kind of institution who does any kind of institutional planning, um, are have a short shelf life. They are unlikely to be fulfilled in a way that is faithful to their original intentions, and for all sorts of good reasons. And they're almost always trumped by not just culture, but emergence, emergent opportunities,
Mm.
emergent processes, emergent relationships. And so there's kind of this art piece that kicks in that sort of is as important or more important than the science piece. Um, and again, I think a lot of that refers to intuition, instinct, um, and the idea that you can't plan your way to a great business.
Mm.
Not to say planning doesn't have its role, and I'm trained as an urban planner, so I'm supposed to believe in planning, but I will be the first person to tell you emergence always beats planning.
Mm.
So those are just some of the reasons. We outline a a whole variety of reasons why this should be useful and interesting to investors. Oh, and also not just VCs, but other forms of institutional investors,
Yeah.
even philanthropic investors. If you're talking social enterprises or you're talking about uh, out and out philanthropy. Um, Many of these same lessons apply to those kinds of institutional funders.
Yeah, I would even see. Thanks for explaining that. That's, diversifying the portfolio makes so much sense, even on an individual perspective. But I not but I also see a way to vet the idea itself, the solution, aside from the founder, which I agree is always important and sometimes more important than the product or the solution. But if you were to adopt a systems lens over this solution, say how well is it addressing all these other factors within the network, if you will, right? So yeah, I hadn't thought of VC firms being potential candidates to say, we should introduce this in our in our determination of who gets funding and who moves on, or even larger, more government-oriented institutional founders like BDC in Canada, for example. It does make a lot of sense. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and if they're okay, so let's say they're a housing investor. It is very helpful to know to have contextual awareness as an investor around the landscape of players. Who else is out there?
Hmm.
Who else is offering something similar? Who else is offering something actually quite different, and why? Um, and having some knowledge. I mean, good investors also pay a lot of attention not just to financial, market trends and financial trends, um, and monetary policy and so on, the obvious things, but they also pay a lot of attention to geopolitics. A good investor, and not just a VC, but a good long-term investor, will see events like pandemics, wars, um, changes in governments, and respond proactively to what that potentially means, and potentially even allocate or reallocate their investments accordingly, to where the wind is blowing or where the puck is likely to go.
Mm.
And so, savvy investors are situationally aware, and that goes beyond the narrower ambits of the industry that they're investing in, or the broader financial markets. It's a much bigger contextual awareness,
Yeah.
and cultural awareness too. Like I'll give you an example: the generational trend away from car ownership as a kind of like, if you grew up in the 60s or the 70s, it was a totem of freedom to own your own car and hit the open road, and that was a goal that almost everyone universally strove for. That is far less the case today. In fact, that would be a minority, um, especially in an urban context. Young people, it's fairly low on their priority list, owning their own car. So their priority is, well, we need to get around. And uh, and what is that? So if you view transportation from a lens of, uh, you could start to see it from more of a utility lens, for example. But people just need to frictionless means to go from one place to another. That's not that's consistent with their expectations around just in time.
Mm.
And, like if you think creatively enough about this, then you come up with solutions that actually are very successful, because you've anticipated these cultural shifts, these behavior shifts. Um, and sometimes those are precipitated by financial or economic drivers, but sometimes people want to be have more ecologically attuned lifestyles, or they want to travel more, or they don't want to have kids until they're much older. They don't want to have kids at all. Or those are all trends that savvy investors pay attention to. and anticipate in their portfolio.
Mm. And so when you're saying the systems view is to think about all those, I'll use the word factors and how those factors are changing over time, and then what's the right opportunity for the market to respond to that. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah,
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 for sure.
yeah. That does make a lot of sense. So, you know, we talked about this MVP approach, iterative. There's still companies that do this very linear approach, but that's more even problem solving implementation. Entrepreneurs are going quick to solve problems or maybe even replicating a solution that they see, but doing it their own way. What's the value? You know, if you had to say, yes, you should take a systems thinking approach to you should spend 55 minutes understanding what the problem is before you solve it. Like what's the, you know, if you had to summarize the value it provides compared to other approaches today, what would that be?
So first, I would say there's a it's an opportunity cost. So the cost of not thinking deeply about the problem is time lost. And I'm going to quote George Constantinescu here, who's the chief transformation officer at APCO, just
Right. Yeah.
retired last month. But he said, that's time lost to false starts, poor decisions, and unintended consequences.
Mm,
And so if you don't, so I mean, I'll give you an example from the world of geopolitics. We've seen, with the invasion of Iran, um, we've seen no clear objective, or
mm,
more accurately, a range of objectives articulated um, from different senior officials who are involved in that, the which paints the story of actually you didn't really have a clear objective, and
yeah.
so you rushed into this thing. Do you have a have you thought it through? Have you thought through all of the potential consequences? Probably not. So there will be unintended consequences from this action. They may be fairly benign if it's over quickly, but if it drags on, that's something that we'll need to watch for. I mean, world wars don't start because people say, "Okay, it's time for a world war."
Mm,
They sort of it becomes a basin of attraction where countries, nations end up falling into it because they're dragged into it for one reason or the other, and one by one that happens. So there's, I'm not suggesting this is the beginning of World War III, but it is one possible outcome among many
mm,
that the theater of war could um, implicate many more nations, and that's a like that's a perfect case study of rushing into
mm,
a rash solution has these unintended consequences. Obviously, AI, boy, I mean, we could talk for days about
mm, mm,
about this in AI, and there's pressure, right? The system itself, in terms of AI innovation, re- sort of requires or pushes these companies to get products out that haven't been adequately tested or haven't been adequately iterated or adequate safeguards put in place. Partly because we don't know half the safeguards that should be put in place. We may not know how to put them in place. Um, and you know what? If we don't, company over here or China or whatever is going to beat us to the punch. So we need to get something out. And and of course, there are many, and in some cases, really profound unintended consequences with doing that that we're seeing play out in the public arena. So yeah, like there's we see lots of examples of solving the wrong problem precisely. We're really good at that.
mm,
Um, and that's what happens if you don't embrace this. Or if you don't, and when I say this, I just mean a an opportunity to ask a set of questions so that you can have a richer understanding of the nature of the problem. You're never going to have a complete understanding. That's impossible. You'll never have a perfectly objective understanding, but to increase the resolution of your understanding, um, you're gonna save costs over the long run.
mm,
You will save time even over the long run. And we're not. every context is different. So we're not saying take years or take months. Sometimes it's just a matter of taking a few days or a
Right.
few hours to
Right.
think things through. So it's not, it, it probably sounds more onerous than it is. And, and we get asked the question a lot, like, how do I know when I've spent enough time understanding the problem? Um, how do I know when I have enough information to actually act? And my sort of standard response is to review each of so in the book, out of the 20 chapters, 11 of those chapters are about tools. And each of those 11 chapters opens with a particular question. And if you can can provide a reasonably strong answer to each of those questions, then you're in great shape. So you don't have to stress unduly about this. So I'll give you an example. Like, um, what's how did we get here? So there's a chapter on origins. Like, do a little bit of backtracking in time. Like, how did this problem even come to be? Do you know anything about that? What? How? Why do we have this problem? Where might we be going if nobody does anything or if nobody provides any kind of solution or intervention? Oh, and another one is, how is the system experienced by those within it? And this is really important. So there's a whole field of UX and understanding the
Mm,
user perspective, but quite often that isn't applied until after the ideation and even prototyping phase. So
mm.
you've got users testing prototypes or market strategies, um, but quite often you don't actually start with an understanding of where a user's at. Um, so if you're proposing a piece of tech, let's say, um, to assist the elderly in one respect or another, then there's a lot of potential for robotics in the kind of age tech space, for example. Lots of room for sensors, for um, uh, GPS enabled uh, tech that understands where seniors are at if they've had a fall. Like
Mm.
there's some cool stuff out there. But if you actually don't have a baseline knowledge of where, if that's your target audience, what do they like? What do they want? Would they ever use this? Would they, uh, do they run from technology? Well, how simple would it have to be to get them to use? Like
Mhm.
all these things, even before you get to a kind of ideating or prototyping phase,
Eh,
um, you need to understand something about power as well. Systems um, endure because people benefit from the system as it is. And so we may complain that the healthcare system is broken or that, any number of systems are broken. But there are people who benefit from the status quo. Um,
mm.
we can criticize it, but there's a reason it is the way it is. In this country, we've heard a lot of lofty talk about eliminating provincial trade barriers, for example. Well, it's hard to do, and the reason it's hard to do is because there are many people, there are industries, there are domestic and boutique industries, cultural industries, and so on that benefit, and sometimes for very good reasons, that benefit from the rules as they are and will have a stake in not wanting to change those rules. So we might be high and mighty about our language, but when it comes down to it, the incentive landscape says, well, hold on,
Mhm.
let's not be too hasty here.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's more on that particular point that we should have another discussion on. Um, I wanted to come back to these 11 questions. It's 11, right? Yeah, 11 questions
It
that
is, yes,
one would
yes.
ask. And my sense is that in a system that is changing more regularly than we would know, so let's say the war or maybe even Canadian policy, well, maybe that's not as fast changing, Canadian government policy or AI, would we ask those questions repeatedly or over, would we sort of let some time go by and say, okay, what has changed? Is there a shift in power dynamics? Is there something, a new actor within the system? Is that something that would make sense as well? Or, I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, we played with different metaphors. We landed on this kind of clock metaphor to organize those 11 chapters. So you can imagine that, like, the idea is that there are 12 5-minute increments in an analog clock, 11 of which are the 11 chapters kind of thing. And then the last chapter is when you act. That's a tidy metaphor, but
Mm.
it's wrong as a model.
Okay.
Um, and a more helpful or accurate model might be something where you continually go back to how you're framing the
Mm.
problem. Like, after each time you ask a question and try out a tool, it should, if it's successful, slightly change the nature of the problem as you thought it was initially. And now that you know more about it, oh, it's actually turned out to be a slightly different problem.
Hmm.
Um, or maybe it's a deeper problem, or maybe it's just framed it a little differently. And with any system, these things are dynamic, and some are really dynamic. And so you're right. Um, one snapshot in time may not provide you enough. You may have to, like, revisit and revisit and revisit. And again, it's a reminder to say this isn't a binary think first, do later.
Hmm.
This is a think and do dialogue that should continue, not just in an innovation phase, but really in an implementation phase as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it should inform. I mean, operationalizing the 55 minutes to me isn't. Yes, one pathway is a kind of um, is embedding or appending to venture development process, but actually, just as maybe even more importantly, is to embed this into a learning culture in any organization. Um, and so, yeah, so yes, you should um, consider in an innovation pathway, maybe embrace something like a problem pitch prior to or
Mm.
alongside a traditional venture or product pitch, um, so that people can actually convincingly pitch their deep understanding of the problem itself. That's not such a crazy idea because it does exist in the student world. Um, Another approach is to develop, you can call it precursor landscape scan. So before the kind of discovery, testing, launch phase, really undertake evidence-backed scanning that maps out the rules, the roles, the relationships, the resources, the trends in the market.
Mm.
Um, how are your partners aligned with this approach? Whether those are your suppliers, your investors, do they
Mm.
share this commitment, or is this going to be a constant kind of dissonance?
Yeah. Yeah.
And offer them resources to build this shared capacity. And never outsource problem understanding. Like, this is so important to do it inside the organization. And here's where embed this learning and these tools into everyday workflows. Um, ATCO Ventures, they use the problem framing canvas, which is in our framing chapter. They use it with managers. They even use it with field staff. It helps teams be more explicit and precise about the problem that they're identifying. It helps expose kind of underlying assumptions. It helps teams achieve greater alignment on the problem they're trying to solve and how it's described. Um, and and it's helped them really stick steadfastly to, like, never start an innovation process with ideation or brainstorming solutions. That's not where you should ever start. Start with questions.
Mm.
If you're going to have a team retreat, if you're going to have a managerial or governance retreat, consider that as a kind of consider a part of it as an almost a carnival of beautiful questions. Like, just ask questions, make it a
Mhm.
solutions free zone, at least for a while,
Yeah.
so that you can have a different kind of conversation and not be seduced by the quick
Yeah.
and the obvious.
Yeah, it's look, I have to say I really like when you said do not outsource problem understanding. And I think um, we may be trending to do more of that with the use of AI, like personally to try to, how do I write this email? What should I do in this situation? What should I choose? Right? I'm looking at very simple examples, but I think that there's a bigger trend that could be happening. But I think that's a really important point. And even your approach around, or when you said integrating this into or adopting this into some form of a learning culture, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially as industries are going through, I think, a big change now. And it's not about just using AI to automate what you've done today. It's really using AI to say, okay, well, do we still need to do those things? Right? You don't want to automate a process that is no longer even relevant based on tools and so on. Right? So, but I'll just come back. Do not outsource problem understanding. I think that was a really important point for me, at least. Um,
And yeah, I mean, and a good point that yeah, outsourcing these days also mostly means AI.
yeah,
and
yeah,
and yeah, and it's I mean, AI is an amazing tool. I use it. It's and it's really good. I mean, insofar as talking about large language models, it's really, really, really good at pattern sensing and pattern
hmm,
seeking. It is not, however, a logical inference machine. So you can't necessarily rely on its causal prowess to say, X causes Y, causes Z. That you have to, I mean, everything you should independently verify, but there's some things that AI will help you with in terms of finding blind spots, seeing novel connections, especially across disciplines or across sectors, which it's really good at. Um, it won't, however, be as reliable for the kind of logic
uh-huh,
of what causes what to do
yeah,
what,
yeah,
and can you verify
yeah,
that?
yeah. Or thinking outside the box, right? Outside the data that it's leaning into to provide you the responses, right? Um,
Exactly. Yeah.
James, how long did it take you to write this book?
Um.
How many hours? Do you know how many hours?
Oh gosh, I no, I actually don't.
Yeah,
I mean, it was a an idea that we started to storyboard
yeah.
almost 5 years before we published. So it was launched last May,
Mm,
um, and I remember our first kind of storyboarding retreat. It was in Boulder, Colorado,
mm,
just before the COVID
nice. Yeah.
lockdown measures happened. And we had a very different idea about what it was going to be. We didn't even know it was going to be a book. We just
Mm,
thought, oh, it's a resource. Maybe it's going to be a website. Maybe it's going to be some kind of application. I don't know. And um and it was and we actually hadn't connected with ACO yet.
mm,
It was ACO that really kicked us into high gear because it made us realize in the commercial sector, there's a huge urgency for this type of thinking, this type of writing, this type of approach. And we were still mainly in a kind of academic student oriented space with this to
mm,
say, okay, we just need, students and educators and maybe a range of practitioners,
yeah.
broadly speaking, to be exposed to this. Um, we had already done a guide for students in a particular problem understanding competition, uh, and and that proved to be really popular, not just with students, but actually we had businesses, we had civil servants, we had doctors, teachers calling us up and saying, We stumbled across this guide. I know it's for students, but would you ever consider doing something like this for practitioners?"
Uh-huh.
And so that really started to sort of build and build and build, and then we finally realized, yeah, we gotta bear down and do this. So really, 90% of the writing was literally kind of early 2024
Wow.
to spring 2025.
Okay. So, but total time though, roughly 5 years, right? It sounds like from inception to
Yeah,
pen
from
to paper.
inception to completion. Yeah.
Yeah. 500 pages. or so, right?
570. Yeah.
570, I'm sorry. And I would believe that it was more than that initially, and then you probably had to cull it down.
Yeah, it was about actually we had raw material wise, we had enough for about 900 pages. And so it was a pretty severe cull from what we
Yeah.
initially had.
And and
Um,
um, and a large amount of your time, for sure.
for sure. Yeah, I mean it's I would say there's been as much time speaking about the book, talking about the book, promoting the book, workshopping the book
Yeah.
as there was writing the book. I think it's probably about 1 to 1 now. Um, so it's really interesting to see who is interested in the book and why. And some of it we didn't really see coming. We've had a lot of interest from schools of engineering, from computer scientists, from health practitioners. I'm not as surprised because health is inherently complex. Um, yeah, and lots of trainers, leadership trainers, leadership consultants have really embraced the book. Um, and have started to bring a kind of systems approach into
Mm,
their work around leadership or around corporate training, for example. And the cool thing, I mean, this is an open access resource, so any company um, could could take this and integrate it into their own training modules, their own proprietary approaches. Echo's interest is they rightly want to be seen as leaders and are leaders in this kind of systems led approach to innovation. But they want to universalize it. They truly believe that this has huge potential for uptake and adoption um, across a lot of different domains.
mm,
And we have about a dozen schools who have at post-secondary, so universities, colleges, art
mm,
schools, polytechnics, that are using this in array of courses, everything from design thinking or systems thinking to public policy, public administration, urban planning, entrepreneurship, social innovation, social work, future studies. So it's we're seeing all or parts of the book being used in really
mm.
interesting ways now.
I would have to believe as well. We used the word, or you talked about opportunity cost before, and there was probably an opportunity cost for you. Time spending on this book meant time not doing other things. And why I'm kind of asking these series of questions is to come to, what's the impact that you want this book to have, and not this book, this understanding, this approach. If you had to say, my mission statement is this, what would that be?
Yeah, I want people in all walks of life, in all sectors, all communities, all industries, to see that value of the crucial pause to to embrace and not shy away from or cower from complexity. Complexity is the way of the world. It comes naturally to human beings to embrace complexity, and we need to rediscover that. We've had a few hundred years since sort of Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes of um, applying a much more reductionist, binary, linear frame to how we see the world. And we're seeing now the limitations of that frame.
Mm,
So if we can, and all of that is really good. It's brought us tremendous things in medical science, in astronomy, in so many areas, in engineering and so on. But we now need to kind of rediscover and reawaken that other part, which is the complexity of bracing, the ability to see the connections of think not just things but all things, right? Every problem is a symptom of a deeper problem. Every system is connected to every other system in some way, um, and ultimately to do less solutioneering in a vacuum and more and even I mean ideally want us to get away from talking about solutions at all.
mm,
And honestly, I mean, we it is about embracing a way that sees each and every person and organization as contributing to shifting a system in some way for the better. But also to recognize that every time we implement a shift, or let's call it a solution, every solution, it contains the seeds of some new problem, some other
Mm.
problem. Usually we can't see it. Sometimes we can't see it for years, for decades, but there is no perfect solution to anything. Every solution contains within it the next problem. Um, and and so to get away from that kind of binary good, bad, right, wrong thinking, and I especially hope that that happens in our systems of schooling and education.
Mm.
I reflect back on I think kids naturally have a natural ability to embrace a lot of this type of thinking. Like I think they automatically see wholes. They don't just see parts. We have to teach reductionism. We have to teach analysis, but they come to the world with a kind of natural holistic or synthetic thinking, right? And then that is a natural way for humans to think. And they naturally are drawn to kind of a relational sensibility about things, right? And um, after 16 or 17 years of school, like K to 12 plus undergrad, it's largely for most students still a solitary competitive journey.
Hmm.
And it, I think back to how I had to learn to network in grad school. It took enormous work, enormous psychological pain to be comfortable with that, which is crazy because that shouldn't that's the way humans naturally should be. Um, and so in the context of making the leap from a garden variety student or employee to somebody with leadership potential, um, I gotta say, school didn't prepare me at all
Mm.
for a career centered on innovation. Not until like there were a handful of teachers and courses and so on, but as a system, whether that's K to 12 or whether that's post secondary, not doing a good job, and that needs to shift. And so if this book and our work can nudge those institutions into more of a systems embracing frame, then I think I'll be immensely grateful for that.
Yeah. So let me ask you a little bit more on that. So back to this point, what was your mission and the impact do you want this to have? And you've described that. You've talked about schools being a place to help enable that outcome. Are there other factors? Is there one other factor or two other factors do you think are critical places where that this change needs to take place in order to achieve this mission that you have?
Yes, I mean I think and I don't have a solution. Not surprisingly, but the challenge of distraction in our society today. I heard a figure the other day that our attention spans are dropping about 33% every 2 years.
Mm.
And for people under 30, it's even worse. It's the ability to focus and to concentrate is just becoming harder and harder. And at the same time, we're seeing um, the atrophy of some of our mental capacities as we are saturated with technological devices and um, problem um, superficially problem solving kinds of tech around us, right? And so there's a vulnerability that gets built in, a fragility that gets built in. I mean, can we, if things were to, um, if we were to have, say, a Carrington style solar flare event like they had in the 19th century, um, it would essentially kill all of our electric or electronic devices. It would take us years if not decades, to build back civilization. Um, it's not a matter of if that'll happen, it's a matter of when. It might not happen for 1,000 years, but these events will happen. Things happen that you cannot foresee. Um, and when that happens, do we as a species have the necessary resilience to bounce back? I know that's going to a pretty dark place pretty quickly, but quite honestly, I think that should be very, very high on our agenda of figuring out what we should be investing in and why. We now spend more time on our phones in Canada. The average Canadian spends more time on our phones than we do sleeping. We've just crossed that Rubicon this year,
Wow.
and that maybe that's not a bad thing, but that's something we should at least be caring about and concerned about and knowing more about. What are the implications of what that means?
So are you saying thinking about those topics uh, and drawing attention to that is what I'll say, well, more thinking of those topics is what I'm going to say you need in order for us to shift and apply more of this system thinking approach and spend more time on understanding what the problem is? Is that
Yeah,
sort of like
I
a
guess my
push?
point is that I feel like the main response, while there's been a generally, a lot of interest in the book and some great conversations, I do get that the constant theme is, but you know what, we don't have enough time. There's just not enough time. This sounds like a lot of work. This sounds like a lot of, and um it's not as daunting as that. It's not asking everyone to be a scholarly researcher. It's asking you to just ask some really basic questions about context, so you're not flying blind. Um, but what's interesting to me is that is the reaction,
Mm,
that is the source of anxiety and the source of pushback. And it's not that we don't have enough time. I mean, I last year I did a scan for the Alberta government looking at declining rates of voluntarism. And it's declining. Voluntarism is declining across the country, in fact, across the Western world, um, as are charitable donations, as are things like our neighborhood networks are shrinking, our family networks are shrinking, our family sizes are shrinking, our friendship networks are shrinking. Um, we have more anxiety, especially among young people, to just be in a public space or in a quasi-public space like a mall. All these things are feeding on each other and feeding off each other in ways that are, to me, suggesting that we um, w- we are not. There's a fragility that is creeping in to the structure of our society that we don't yet know. The other shoe hasn't dropped yet,
mm,
and um, one of those shoes could be a pretty serious um, a pretty serious challenge to the healthy state of our democracy or our civil society. Right? We saw little bits of this. We saw a little preview of this with the trucker convoy in Ottawa.
mhm,
And people were totally shocked. Like, where did this come from? How did this come to be? I quite honestly believe the trucker convoy was a minor prelude to something much more major that is yet to come.
mm,
Um, and I don't think we should be smug as Canadians to think, oh, it can happen in the U.S., but it won't happen here. I think th- and that and again, I'm going to a dark place with this, but when I think about what are the obstacles or barriers that could prevent the impact of a book like this from being achieved, I do think it's that sense of fragility attached to, we are a distracted populace with very short attention spans, very little
mhm,
time
mhm,
to think deeply about anything. Um, and so I don't know. It's
mm.
one. perhaps it's a shout in the darkness, but it's one way in which I really hope that we can step back and think more deeply
Yeah.
about all of all of these things,
Yeah.
so we can be a little smarter about how we um, construct our societies and economies and livelihoods and communities and so on.
It's a predicament from the way you described it. The very thing we need to adopt this approach and integrate it into organizations or to the school systems, which is time, or the ability to give time to it, is the very same thing that it's causing us to resist wanting to do this, where there's this
Exactly.
great sense of
Yeah.
urgency and not enough time, and it's done yesterday. It needs to happen, and yeah, that's a difficult scenario to work through. James, what's the next 12 months for you, right? I mean, what do you have some, I'll use the word plan around what you want to accomplish with this approach to looking at problems more deeply? How do you plan to, at a high level, not spread the word, but really operationalize this, integrate this? Do you have some form of uh, tactics in place that you want to achieve over the next 12 months?
Yeah, great question. So in the short term, I've realized number one piece of feedback from people is, "Hey, this is a great resource, but it's 570 pages. Sorry to tell you, but I don't have that kind of time." And so connected to the last question, um, and responding to that, yeah, if this was a fantasy novel, no problem. 570 pages is small. But this is really just a business book, right? And that's a pretty daunting length. So, the response to that is a few other new layers of getting this messaging out. So, I'm starting a 55-minute Substack,
Okay.
and that'll have ideally one post a week
Yeah.
that just takes concepts that are in the book and sort of brings them to life. Sometimes we'll tell stories that are in the book, sometimes stories that are outside of the book. Um, the other thing attached to that will be a series of YouTube explainers,
Hmm.
on just really quick 5-minute explainers to say, okay, here's a concept like requisite variety, or like, um, you know, um, there's 30 tools in the book. So take one video per tool, and let's explore that, build a story around it, but digestible in a much smaller pieces. What I haven't gotten to yet, or had got my head around, is the more micro TikTok, Instagram level
Hmm.
engagement. That's a possibility. We're exploring what that could look like. I probably wouldn't be the person to do that, quite honestly. I think it would be somebody else who either from ACCO or um somebody that we engage
Yeah.
on this work to reach y- yet a different audience,
Yeah.
in that kind of like microdose kind of way.
Yeah.
Um, that's a missing piece that I think we want to spend a good amount of time on
Yeah.
over the next year.
J-
Um,
just to just
Also
to
reaching out, we've
just to jump
discovered
in.
that, yeah.
Sorry, I was curious. What about and forgive me, maybe this is what you're going to talk about. Some of those more organizational partnerships. So I think of in Canada, Futurepreneur. I think there's
Mm,
YE, but Futurepreneur for sure, or even like Junior Achievement, which is very high school oriented programs. Is like, do you have uh, a thought on working with them as another way to, this is my word, infiltrate those systems with your, not with your, but with this approach? Is that something that would make sense, or, maybe not so much?
yeah, that's a really great question. And no, we haven't really talked about that level of integration. We have, I mean, the partnerships that I mentioned with the systems innovation challenge that's run by the IB School in Canada, and the global challenge that's run by the Scholl Center at University of Oxford. Those are two post-secondary level partnerships that we've attached the book and the lessons from the book to, um, and that kind of there is a kind of constant dialogue between those challenges and what
Mhm.
we talk about in the book. But no, we have not uh, explored that wider array of potential kind of civil society based training or professional development opportunities. I really like that. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, I remember I had, this is years ago now, involvement in junior achievement, not in from a student perspective, but from a workplace. They came to work with us in our company when I was in the corporate world, and I think they were building a business or something like that. But either way, I think that's, um, when you talk about where do you, even earlier you said, when you're much younger, you do tend to have that more holistic view of things before you are, conditioned or programmed to think very linearly about things, right? So that could be something. What I also have, um, I would say, come to appreciate from my own experience. So having been in the corporate world for 20 plus years, not only in the corporate world, but even working with entrepreneurs and businesses outside, and now working or in academia, and I'm even back in school myself, is there's a value, I think, in not I think there's a value in being able to translate what I would say is complexity of the academic world into a language that is much more understood and appreciated, and then able to actually, operationalize, to do something with that. And even then, I just said a lot of words with unnecessary. Let's look at this word, institutionalism or isomorphism, right? Or mimetic isomorphism, chorus isomorphism. If we had to simplify that, that is really around credibility. Right? How do you get credibility with your customers? Do you copy what others are doing? Are you forced to do certain things in terms of certain standards? Do you just do things because it's the norm, right? And so that was one of my, I would say, aha moments when I started teaching organization design, and there was just a lot of this, really long words that I found, to be honest, complicated things. In some cases, could,
Mm.
what's the word I want to say? Almost intimidate's not the right word, but almost discourage people to really want to continue understanding and listening. So that's just my experience. And when you said going on YouTube or even TikTok, of course there'd be a different language in that, but I found that ability to take something complex and much more universally understood was a powerful way to kind of get the message across as well. So
I love
just
that. It's funny. You would think systems thinking would be kind of discipline agnostic. It would be truly whatever your preference phrase is, transdisciplinary, even anti-disciplinary. Um, but we've found that in certain jurisdictions, there's a critical mass of system, let's call them system scholars, that it actually has become its own discipline, and it has then developed its own kind of standards of excellence or norms of its own language space. And that can be quite exclusive. And so, one of the things I've noticed is when somebody creates something, let's say it's a facilitation guide or a quick shorthand to some aspect of systems thinking or understanding a particular tool, the social media activity around it from the sort of systems scholars who've spent decades in the field studying this stuff, you would hope or think that it would be, hey, this is great to have another tool, great to have some interest in our field, in our work. More often than not, though, the reaction is, you don't understand this stuff because you're just a tourist. You're coming in with not enough information, not enough context. Where are your credentials? Where are your sort of systems, um, your official system credentials? And that kind of stuff turns people off. Like because like you're saying, like they'll be intimidated. They'll be like, well, oh, I guess I'm not doing it right. And, I heard that I'm supposed to be doing this systems thinking stuff. But, we did a thing and, well, we got a lot of blowback from it, or we did it in a particular way and it didn't really work out. And it felt really obscure and filled with jargon and really, and, and so there's a lot of ways in which this could fail. Um, and it's not just scholars, it's often consultants too,
Mm,
who say, this is my approach, you're not doing it right, that consultant over there doesn't do the right thing. And what I wish for is, uh, really, not so, like, I'm not saying we need to be so relativistic that anything goes, but we do need to be heterodox. We do need to accept that there are different pathways, there are different languages, there are different ways in which people enact this way of thinking and acting and practicing. And one of the oldest, of course, is most indigenous societies, are naturally systems thinkers and apply many of these tools just as a course of, this is, of course you would. Like, how would you do it any differently? So the notion, for example, that the nature of reality is relational, it's not necessarily the fundamental nature of reality is more relational than it is about particles or things. That's something that, for example, the Blackfoot worldview, um, or Blackfoot cosmology holds that to be very strong. That relationships at the heart of reality. That's kind of the insight from systems thinking as well, through a whole series of sort of Western scholarly processes and publications. But now we just need to say, "Oh, well, we've arrived at these similar conclusions through different, knowledge pathways, and that's okay. And we can call things different things, and we can have that heterodoxy, and we don't have to be, um, evangelically precise with our definitions and our construction of models and the fidelity to those models, all of which are wrong anyway, to in order to have integrity. And that's what I hope that, this probably won't happen, but I hope that systems thinking, or whatever we call it, is genuinely the first anti-disciplinary
mm.
scholarly field, if that's even possible. I don't know,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, James, this is the last question for you. What are the three key takeaways you want to say about systems thinking, the 55 minutes? Uh, you know, I don't want to say the book, but what do you want to say? What would be three key points that you say? This is, if
Yeah.
you're only listening to the last 3 minutes, and I hope very few do, they normally listen to the entire episode. What would be those 3 points?
So the first is just building on that last comment. There are many, many entry points and pathways. And those entry points, some of them are scholarly, and that's super interesting. Some of them are theoretical, and that's super interesting, but it's not for everyone. Some of them are simply, um, living your life in an authentic way and in lots and lots of contact with the natural world, because the natural world will teach you about systems better than any human could.
Mm,
And so just to understand, there are many, many entry points and pathways to understanding this way of thinking and working. That's first point. Second point is, the 55 minutes is not a guide. It's not a trademarked process. It's a set of tools, concepts, and frameworks that you should see as a buffet, and as a very adaptable buffet. And we encourage that. For each and every tool, we talk about how we've used it, and how, with suggestions for how you might consider using it or adapting it. Um, and use what resonates. Don't view it as a sort of trademarked process or the way, and don't trust any guides that claim to be the way.
mm,
Just like you shouldn't trust any trademark diet. They all have
mm,
something to contribute, but none of them are perfect. Um, those would be the first two things. The third takeaway is, again, appreciate the crucial pause.
mm,
Appreciate the value of stopping and taking a rest, taking a breath, and it's okay. It's not only is it okay to think more deeply about the problem, it is necessary precisely because of the urgency of the problems that surround us.